I was an anesthesiologist for 20 years. I had a back pain practice. I had a simultaneous overlapping software career in scalable software. And about a year ago, I opened a pain practice locally, focusing only on laser treatment of pain. So what's inside of your head? We all know there's a conceptual model of the head, which looks like this. And there are various lobes, but the actual what's inside of our head, the brain, is actually pretty gnarly looking. It's just a lot nicer looking. So the brain is divided into lobes. There's the frontal lobe, you may have heard about. The frontal lobe is it's our executive function. As someone said, the CEO of our brain, the back of the brain, is what is responsible for vision. And people, basic scientists, have broken the areas of the brain down into functional areas. So we know that one area is responsible for speech, and one area is responsible for vision. And people talk about the functional areas of brain. There are only two types of brain cells, only two. There's the thinking cell. You may have heard of that, that's the neuron. If you watch the movie Concussion, they probably talk about it. And then the other type of cell is what I call the good vibe cell. And good vibe cells are actually key. These are technically called glial cells. And these ensure that there's a good vibe, a good environment within the brain. Actually, one other thing that I want to point out from here, this is a schematic of a brain cell. This thing is really gnarly looking. And the takeaway here is that the brain is a great unknown to both scientists as well as to everyone else in this room and everyone around. It's impossible to know everything that's going on in the brain. So there are 80 billion thinking cells. The same number of cells that we have in our brain it's the same number that are of stars in the Milky Way. It's a huge number. And what that means is that when you have a concussion, when you have a brain injury, when you watch Bob Grant give himself a brain injury, that a few cells, a few hundred, a few thousand cells might be injured, but we have billions of spares. It's only when you get millions and potentially billions of cells, neurons, damaged, that we start to see the effects. But as somebody said back in Washington, D.C., a billion here and a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real brain power. There are also 80 billion good vibe cells. And these good vibe cells are not just support cells. These are not just things like tables and chairs. The good vibe cells are as essential as the thinking cells. Without a good vibe cell, we would just not be able to exist. The brain is lightweight, so if you take it out of the skull, the brain only weighs about 3 pounds. About the same amount of weight as 2 women's feet. 2 petite feet weigh about the same as our brain. But the brain is power hungry. The brain uses 20%. This little thing up here that weighs the same as 2 feet takes 20% of all of our energy. Brain damage can occur when any of those 160 billion cells are damaged. It may not necessarily be a billion or 2 billion, it might just be a few thousand cells that are damaged. Damage can be temporary or permanent, or it can just be permanent, we think it's permanent until we find a cure. The body is designed to pump energy into the brain. Now, if you're a brain scientist, you think that the world revolves around the brain, and it's really true. Other people think that our body performs other functions, but it's really just there to support our brain. So it all starts off with turkey dinner. Turkey's converted into a type of sugar called glucose, and the heart pumps that glucose into the brain. At the same time, oxygen that we're breathing turns red blood cells, gives them their oxygen, and the heart pumps that into the brain. So you can already see the entire purpose of our entire body is to pump food and energy into our brain. The brain then takes that energy and passes it through the good vibe cells. These are not passive cells. They're very, very active. And those good vibe cells pass up to the actual thinking cells, where we can then perform a maneuver like this. Now this football player is firing on all cylinders. Their brain is going wild. They're using all 160 billion of their brain cells and their muscles to do this. None of this happens without all of these things, all this food and energy pumping into the brain. There's one universal energy source in our entire body and our brain, and it's a chemical called ATP. ATP doesn't get its due course because most people haven't heard about it, but it's very important. We wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be able to think, we wouldn't be able to execute those fantastic plays on the field without ATP. Outside of the body, energy is taken in the form of your turkey dinner. Inside of the body, we convert that turkey dinner into a sugar called glucose. And inside of the cell, energy is always in the form of ATP. It's a magic chemical. Without ATP, we couldn't do anything here. We couldn't think about it, we couldn't figure it out, we couldn't have signed the contract that Leigh gave us. We couldn't have done anything without ATP. And where does ATP come from? ATP comes from a powerhouse within our cells called the mitochondria. The mitochondria do a bunch of things, but their primary job is to take turkey and oxygen and turn it into ATP so we can do our daily living, so we can perform plays on the field, and so we can think. ATP is the center of the universe as far as the brain is concerned. Now, a good vibe is essential to brain health. We have 80 billion thinking cells, but we have 80 billion cells totally responsible for creating a good vibe within the body. Now, if you're a scientist, you might already have recognized that the good vibe is it's generally referred to as homeostasis. And back in about 150 years ago, a French guy really coined the term called the milieu intérieur. But the concept is that our brain is in a constant state of trying to basically maintain a good vibe. You may not feel well, but the brain is always feeling in a state of homeostasis. And of those support cells, half of the cells, again, they're not lecturers, they use up 1/3 of the energy just to maintain our brain state. Even if we're sleeping, 1/3 of the energy goes to supporting their functions. So we're going to talk about brain injuries next, and we're talking about 3 types of brain injuries: CTE, the football disease that we all are familiar with; TBI, which is traumatic brain injury. Again, it's a type of concussion, being knocked out, whatever you want to call it. It's a brain injury that's caused by trauma. And a related disease called PTSD, which is a stress disease. It's, some people think of it as a mental issue that our troops get, that civilians can get, that is not a result of physical trauma, but a result often of mental trauma. These 3 diseases overlap considerably, both in how you can potentially treat them and what causes them. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but some of the more interesting ones between CTE, TBI, and PTSD, all 3 cause depression. We've heard about depression is a big factor, and it's impossible to know whether when somebody has had a lifetime of football, whether that's from a concussion, from traumatic brain injury, from CTE, perhaps it's even PTSD. One of the differences is over here in suicide. Primarily, you'll see, I'm not sure if I actually drew the slide right, but CTE should have suicide, and PTSD has suicide. Nightmares and sleeplessness are more related to PTSD and TBI, but there's overall a huge overlap between these 3 diseases. You may have, if you know anything about CTE or you watched the movie Concussion, you may have heard about a chemical in the body, a protein called tau. And you might have actually come away with the impression that tau is bad. It turns out that tau is a normal protein found in all of our brains. It's essential. Tau is essential, not as important as ATP, but it's essential for brain functioning. It's when tau gets to be a tau tangle that it represents a problem. What's unknown is whether that's the chicken or the egg. Tau tangles are not specific to CTE. They're present in many, many brain diseases, and nobody yet knows whether the tau tangle comes causes the problem or whether it represents the problem. So we're going to talk now about ATP and how they generate a good vibe and why that's so important. So when you get an injury, the injury could be a mild concussion, it could be Bob Brand going like this, it could be traumatic brain injury, it could be virtually anything, PTSD. The injury causes trauma to the thinking cells. So you heard Leigh talk about somebody, a football player, who was post-concussion. They had trauma to their thinking cells. They asked the same questions over and over again. Very common, right? That's what we think about the person is knocked out, semi-permanent, permanent brain damage. We all think about damage to the thinking cells. That's actually not where the money is. That's not where the money is. The money is in the damage to the good vibe cells. Because left to their own devices, the good vibe cells would help the thinking cells heal. So that's why if you've ever, most of us are old enough to have suffered some minor concussion in our life where we saw stars. You run into the wall, you hit your head on the table, the cabinet bangs you. If you're a football player, then obviously you have many reasons for this. All of those are concussions. They're traumatic brain injuries that most of us have healed from. And the way we healed was that our good vibe cells fixed our thinking cells. Nothing good happens in the brain to correct an injury, to fix an injury, if the good vibe cells don't do their work. And all the work requires ATP. Thinking cells can't think without ATP, and good vibe cells cannot repair and keep a good vibe without ATP. So what happens is, thinking cells, once they've been damaged, they only have two choices in life. Most of the time, they end up being repaired. They go back to being a thinking cell. Obviously, some of the time in CTE, TBI, and PTSD, they end up dying. This is the injured state, but eventually they're either going to recover or die. It's when they die that we end up with the sequela of CTE. And you can already see, you don't have to be a brain scientist, if you're 20 years old and you suffer a concussion or multiple subconcussive hits as a football player here, 30 years later, when you get CTE, it's because those cells have failed to heal. It's because those thinking cells have not gotten the support of the good vibe cells to make them heal. So next we're going to talk about TLT. TLT stands for transcranial laser therapy. It's a promising new way to treat brain injuries, CTE, TBI, and PTSD. Here's a picture of what TLT looks like. It's a handheld laser. It's a couple inches across. It's painless. It's not a pinpoint laser. The laser does not zap or melt anything. The laser is given in the front of the head, and this is, believe it or not, this is also the front of the head, just the way it works. These are both ways to get the frontal cortex, one of those lobes of the head, and the laser penetrates about 2 inches. Oops. Let me see, we skip here, yes. So if you're, from before, there are different lobes to the head, and those different lobes, the different functional areas, are associated with different things, different ways of thinking. Many of the problems associated with traumatic brain injury, TBI, and CTE are associated with the front of the head. I may have run out of juice here. And that includes problem solving, concentration, memory. It includes, of course, sleeplessness, but personality, mood. We've heard about all these things many times today, that all of these problems rear their head in both traumatic brain injury and in, actually this seems to be working, so we're good. So how does transcranial laser therapy work? The reason that I'm so excited about laser therapy is that it increases one of the keys to the brain, which is ATP. Transcranial laser therapy increases ATP in all of the cells that absorb it. So what happens when you give TLT, transcranial laser therapy, it's absorbed by the mitochondria. The mitochondria are the powerhouses that produce ATP, so they of course produce more ATP. From ATP, you can get more, so if it's a good vibe cell, they're going to do more repair work. More anti-inflammatories are going to come out, so inflammation is going to be reduced. Nerve cells will actually regrow when they're exposed to laser by the function of increasing ATP. Everything stems from the increased ATP. Once you have more ATP, the good vibe cells can repair themselves and they can help repair the thinking cells outside of the brain. It's very similar. This is just a picture showing how the laser gets absorbed by the mitochondria, sort of a universal squiggly symbol for mitochondria, and that produces more ATP. So going back to our brain injury, what happens is that when there's transcranial laser therapy, there's more ATP, so the thinking cells can repair themselves, and the good vibe cells have an easier job of doing their job in life, which is repairing the thinking cells. And the goal with transcranial laser therapy is to get more of the thinking cells to go back to living a healthy cell life, and fewer of them to die. The results of TLT are potentially phenomenal. There's only been one study of TLT in brain disease. That was a study done in Denver. It was done on 10 patients with traumatic brain injury. And they used a very small, relatively small laser, but had phenomenal results. So the quick way to look at this slide is red is bad and green is good. It's very simple. So they, for instance, if you look at depression, they measured depression two ways, and after laser therapy, the depression went down by about 30 to 50%. But if you look at something else, so if you look at suicide, which is a big problem in this PTSD, TBI, and CTE, 5 of the 10 patients had suicidal thoughts before treatment. Now, to most of you, other than those of you who've had direct contact with patients who have CTE, this seems hypothetical. But I've got to tell you, these people not only think about suicide, they commit suicide. This is a real problem, and this just goes to show how deranged these diseases make people. After laser treatment, 0 of the 5 had suicidal thoughts. This is a phenomenal result. Sleeplessness, I think I've got the right slide here, sleeplessness, which was present in 10 of the 10 patients, went after treatment to 0. So there are some phenomenal results. Sleeplessness, one of these is employment. Employment, you might think to yourself, is not such a big deal, but employment represents how we function, how a person with CTE, PTSD, and TBI functions in society, how they deal with relationships inside of the house and outside of the house. Because when you have these diseases, you don't feel right, you don't act right, you don't have the emotional stability. So if somebody when Reggie says, hey, we're running a little bit behind, all of us kind of groaned, right? But we didn't come up and want to punch them. But when you have PTSD and TBI and CTE, sometimes you don't have that control. Reggie says, hey, your lecture's delayed by an hour, wham! When a family member says something innocuous, they lose control. It's not their fault. They've lost potentially billions of neurons. And transcranial laser therapy may be one of the solutions. One of the most exciting parts, this paper was published, and one of the most exciting parts of the research to me, my background as an anesthesiologist, is that we're a little different than most other doctors, which is we give a little bit of drug when you come in to go to sleep, and if it doesn't work, we give more and more drug, and we'll give you as much drug as it takes. We're anesthesiologists, so the only people who love to give more drugs than anybody else. So in the locker room, in the NFL locker room, they have a certain talk. In the anesthesia locker room, we have a different kind of talk, and people will brag about how much drug it took to get their last patient to sleep. And somebody will say, I had a patient that took me 1 bucket. Somebody will say, I had a patient, it took me 5 buckets to keep them asleep. We don't actually use buckets, but you get the idea. And to us, to anesthesiologists, that's a sign. The more drug you give and the more effect it has, that's a real drug. Relief of depression they got. And this was one of the most exciting things about the study. So what I'm involved in now is taking the results of this study and getting a research trial going of at least 10, but hopefully 40 patients with TBI, PTSD, and CTE, but using much, much higher doses of laser, 2 times and up to 10 times the laser dose, and accelerating the treatment. The previous